And with that, I think we should move on to our main topic, Kyle. We actually have a lot of news around the main topic that came out recently, specifically Archax, which was quite busy, actually partnering both into R3's Corda to power their blockchain exchange and more focused on their post-close activities. They noted that they absolutely need these services to move forward and scale. And actually, Corda is notable because they're also powering the Swiss Digital Exchange as well with their private blockchain technology. And strangely enough, at the same time, Archax has also partnered with Highcastle, which also has a private distributed ledger technology for exchanges to basically manage their members and their trades on the Archax platform. It certainly would like to get a little bit more clarity on, are they going to be operating together separately, which is offering what function, or are these more kind of just exploratory press releases? But we also mentioned last week, we also heard that the Boston Security Token Exchange is also intending to launch using the Ethereum and record a lot of their ownership and their transactions on the Ethereum blockchain. And finally, we also know a little while ago, the Australian Security Exchange also partnered with VMware and IBM to digitize their platform on the blockchain. And just today, earlier, we mentioned Prometheum is building their own. So we have a lot of news here, Kyle, talking about exchanges themselves leveraging blockchain and distributed ledger technology. All this news kind of also leads to a little bit of slight confusion as a result of where do security tokens come into play, what is the purpose of these blockchains, and how is it all operating together. And so I think it's, of course, first to examine all these different scenarios, specific use cases or value proposition of distributed ledger technology or blockchain for exchanges themselves. In almost all cases, especially across these press releases, it's pretty standardized. It tends to focus around the changing of ownership records, the transfer of securities, and cash to settle and trade. Reporting is another one that's been mentioned. Boston Securities Token Exchange intends to use a whitelist as well so that they can have a closed blockchain to manage their participants, and the smart contracts that power the platform will be built on top of Ethereum to help, of course, with all the other management sides and act as a trading log of the history. So there's a lot of different examples here of really the classic ledger technology, having that perfect sort of uniform record, as well as using smart contracts to certain degrees for changing of the ownerships, which then begs the question, where do security tokens come in? We've seen security token exchanges complement either by adopting other token structures or even developing their own issuance solutions. How that then interacts with the various distributed ledger technologies that an exchange might be using, versus the security token itself having a life of its own to be able to move seamlessly in and out of that ecosystem, certainly is all a fair value add and efficiency to the whole capital markets process. But it certainly brings up some questions, right, Kyle? I mean, for example, we have private blockchains, we have public blockchains. Where does this come into play?
Well, the reality is that there are some significant differences between whether you're going to leverage a private or public blockchain. And so with the Boston Security Tokens Exchange, for example, they want the private blockchain because they can manage the participants, as you mentioned, on the smart contract, but they can also control the gas fees, which are the fees that you have to pay in order to facilitate a transaction on the blockchain. And it also, with a public blockchain, the values there are that you may have greater support from developers, you may have third-party additions, but you don't have quite as much control of the whitelisting of wallets, of being able to CYA and get dedicated support. And with a private blockchain, firms are also able to control the data and information in the system, which can provide more security as long as it's built by a reputable firm, right? So they can keep it in-house, they can manage their own internal systems, and leverage a lot of this technology and the smart contracts for automation, for cheaper costs, for faster speeds, while keeping it in-house. And so in terms of security token support and the DLT, distributed ledger technology system, the major question that comes into account is the support for security tokens to trade on other platforms. And so we'll have to see, will security tokens need to become blockchain agnostic in order to be supported by multiple platforms? in some cases, we see that exchanges developing issuance capabilities themselves, which enables tokenization of assets, used within their platform or outside of it. But we're also seeing issuance platforms themselves that are third party, that don't have the exchange services, that are also trying to develop their own compliance protocols, some that again are open source and some that are not. And so much of the discussion revolves around these issuance platforms themselves and how are they going to be considering or launching or building the tech underneath. And so it's a similar reality in traditional markets where you can build your tech open source, which allows for developer support and third-party interoperability much easier, or you can keep the technology private and maintain a competitive advantage. A lot of companies sometimes try for the latter in terms of keeping it all in-house, but it's only to your peril, because if it works, great, but many of those companies, it will not succeed. And so it requires an expansive network to get off the ground, a lot of money in terms of being able to scale this operation. And it's maybe not the best use of funds for every one of these platforms to try to build their own instead of finding a way to work together. So when it comes to blockchains, it's clear that exchanges can benefit from having a uniform log and trading history, using smart contracts to enable the instant settlement and clearing, and to have that safe and immediate transfer of ownership on the securities and having that on chain. But when it comes to the security token itself, leaving the ecosystem, so leaving that centralized marketplace and going somewhere else, it likely needs the support of one of these open protocols like ST20, DSO, or the T-Rex that will help create that ubiquitous adoption for exchanges, which are presumably in competition and won't necessarily support another exchange's protocol, right? So basically what we're talking about here is that for these exchanges to be able to support all of these things, there likely needs to be this open source one that they can all kind of approve of, and may all have to approve of, because that is the industry standard, and which again is much better for the global transfer of these assets. All of this leads to the desire for one uniform solution, which many of these protocols are trying to be, that will fit all of the different jurisdictions around the world. And most protocols are built on a public blockchain because of the larger supported developers and the usage of the blockchain. But we do see projects like Onera that also desire to build a protocol, but instead believe security tokens need a dedicated blockchain platform, in which their case is built on the Hyperledger fabric. And so there's many different types of blockchains, there's many different solutions here, and like what we're seeing in the crypto space and a lot of these blockchain companies, is we're still trying to figure out the right use case. So it's fun to think about private versus public, because as I'm sure that you as listeners can imagine, many of the startups are creating a lot of these open source protocols, and we definitely are also seeing some of these larger institutional players that are developing things in-house because they can take it slower, they can test things, and they don't need to necessarily put anything out there too early and rush the launch. So
yeah, well, really breaking this down then, from what I hear what you say, Kyle, it sounds like we have a plethora of security tokens that will be entering the market over the years through a variety of different issuance platforms. And it seems like some of them can be traded potentially on exchanges that don't use any blockchain technology whatsoever, centralized information and tools, but at the end of the day, enough to support the trading of the security token itself and their own value proposition. We're seeing examples of exchanges that are then going to be able to leverage distributed ledger technology and blockchain for the actual exchange itself, whether it's on the log history for trading, or whether it's the clearing and instant settlement for different accounts, or whether it's just simply helping with the efficiencies of the technology. And then finally, we also kind of see this example of you have a blockchain-based exchange using the technology that's interacting with security tokens that may or may not be locked out or stuck to that exchange based on whether it can actually leave the system or not. And that is by design, of course, of the exchange itself. So we're going to see a lot of different use cases come to market. I personally don't think you can say one or the other is the right use case. Maybe one day we'll have another topic that forces us to put a little bit more on the line around that. But at this time, I think it's very hard to say what the real differences are going to matter. Certainly, you pointed out the differences in a private versus a public blockchain, but at the end of the day, it's the same function and the same purpose that they're aiming to do. And
what's your prediction for
Yeah, it's a great question. I think if I had to say, probably towards the latter half of 2020 and maybe early 2021, I would imagine that we're going to start to see more uniformity across these exchanges, potentially, emerging through either one-off cross-support partnerships where they develop just to work with each other's systems, or if it's by, hosting one of these, adopting one of these many different protocols that you mentioned that are coming to market, looking to kind of standardize their adoption. And I say that only because I still think we're on that plethora of issuances coming first, right? Exchanges themselves are trying to build volumes and networks, and I think they're primarily focused right now on onboarding assets as opposed to creating liquidity through partnerships with other exchanges. But I certainly think that the whole purpose of this technology is to certainly take advantage of that, and these networks will eventually enable. What do you think?
Yeah, well, I can see that happening, Herwig. We saw a mass conglomeration of exchanges during the tech boom in the early 2000s, and a similar situation might happen on the global stage for security tokens in the coming year or two. But I'm also a little bit suspicious of the largest institutional players that are going to come into this space eventually, and they might not want to give up leverage by working with a public blockchain and protocol. I can see a reality where some of these exchanges that are able to dwarf the smaller players in the industry, whether that's a NASDAQ or a larger exchange in Europe, that institutes a private blockchain issuance on their own ledger and will distribute through maybe pockets of partner networks like what we see maybe in Europe. And so this is an interesting kind of maybe hybrid system. But the biggest piece here that I think that could be an issue would be if one large exchange tries to institute their own blockchain and says, hey, if you want to trade on NASDAQ, you got to use NASDAQ's protocol, and the interoperability is kind of lost there, a global exchange. The other reality is I'm interested to see if some exchanges don't even necessarily launch with a blockchain system at all. This, you can save development costs and just try to partner with the eventual winner, whenever that is, whenever we figure out which one is the
right
successful solution. And the reality is, as we've discussed before, you might not need a blockchain necessarily to exchange security tokens, especially here in the US. We're really just talking about a tech wrapper behind an underlying asset. And so you could theoretically build that in your own centralized system without necessarily needing a blockchain system. But again, that really starts to hurt the interoperability aspects of it and the global exchange, because you can't necessarily build it that way with the jurisdictions all built in.
So tell me, what do you actually predict?
Well, I see a lot of these smaller exchanges end up working together and then getting acquired by some of these larger exchanges. I think that when in doubt, follow the traditional markets. This is something that we saw in the tech boom, and that's what I would predict, is that a lot of these smaller current security token exchanges, or one of the 50 or potentially hundreds that eventually launch around the world, a lot of these will get bought up either by existing institutions or by some of the largest upstarts, that a Coinbase that wants to get into the space and just acquires one of these smaller exchanges and continues to kind of do it ICE style, if you will, in traditional markets. That's what I would predict.
You're not wrong. I mean, that's how NASDAQ came out of nowhere and became one of the biggest exchanges in the world, right, through a series of acquisitions during that time period. I think we always like to reference traditional markets as signs for how the security token market will evolve. So I think that's also a really, really fair approach. I do think that makes me think of something else, which is, of the big players who would presumably be more resistant, how much of a problem was it to begin with to even collaborate because of their personal and private systems and proprietary data and how they were managing it? Simply the concept of interoperability is certainly much, much more challenging without blockchain and security tokens as a part of that equation. So I'm definitely curious to see, would someone like the New York Stock Exchange and NASDAQ eventually take advantage of this potential for interoperability, or will it be only once they see, like your prediction, a wave of smaller exchanges show off that potential, and maybe one day they will collaborate? Certainly because they all own a number of exchanges all around the world through ICE and NASDAQ and many others, I would imagine that at least because they're owned by the same parent company, we might start to see some synergies across the various different exchanges that are owned by the same people using blockchain and security tokens to, again, that interoperability, create more liquidity, create more networks and efficiencies around the whole system.
It's also crucial that global interoperability is important because, as you said, right, there's certainly compliance and cost savings and the ability to invest in more assets, but what that also translates to is a potentially an influx of capital into non-existing markets, right? So if there are international investors that want to invest in U.S. real estate, not only now are they able to invest, so from their perspective, they get more assets to invest in, but from the asset holders themselves, potentially here in the U.S., their property will see a significant increase as the demand increases. So this could be a very effective boom cycle for many traditional assets that benefit from additional investor participation, and can be very, very good for the global economy, for the health of the global economy, because the money is more diversified across international borders to allow for the support in case one economy maybe struggles. You can then be able to move those funds around and properly diversify to stop the bleeding.
Yeah, truly an exciting notion. I think that's what we're all working towards. I think that's what we're all bullish about. And I think that's a wrap for today's episode. I do want to give a quick shout out to my co-host here, Kyle, for his recent birthday on the time of this recording. And I know many fans have also wished him a happy birthday as well. And of course, all of the articles and everything we've talked about today is in the description of wherever you're listening to. And we'll hopefully catch you next week.
Episode 16. Had a blast. Talk to you next week.
Thanks for listening.